test. 1, 2, 5.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 8th Belgrade Security Forum. My name is Sonja Stojanović-Gajić, and I have an honor on behalf of organizers of Belgrade Security Forum to welcome you to the first day of event of our academic discussion. The conference is organized, as you know, by Belgrade Center for Security Policy, European Movement in Serbia, and Belgrade Fund for Political Excellence. And since the beginning of organizing these discussions on foreign policy, security, and generally strategic debates, not just for our region, but the global debates, we had this idea that it's not just enough to have policy wonks, journalists, politicians discussing these matters, but that we also need people whose job is to think and reflect and research. And this is why this forum is unique as having an academic conference as its introductory. Today's academic event is addressing one of the new normalities, and that is the EU as a global actor trying to intervene with the different tools in its neighborhood, its immediate neighborhood like Balkans or the Middle East, or a bit further away in Africa or other continents. And we are questioning how well is EU doing its job in crisis management from Kosovo, Bosnia, Mali to Afghanistan and Iraq. The answers to these questions are going to be provided by the researchers who did not sit in their armchairs but actually visited the field, the conflict areas, talk to the people, and not just those in Brussels designing the missions or in member state capitals, but also those affected by the conflict, living it every day, and living the consequences of EU good intentions. This is also the logic of the project EU UNPEC, funded through Horizon 2020 scheme, that looks bottom up, what are the experiences of the people in areas where the EU is managing crisis. So a number of researchers presenting their papers have done it through this partnership of trans-European network of organizations. They are going to try to provide also not just criticism of EU, but also some suggestions of what could be improved, and hopefully they'll be challenged enough, but they're unusual audience because they're used to talking to each other, but they're not that frequently used to answer questions of people from the regions where EU intervenes, policymakers, journalists, diplomats. So we really hope to have an exchange and to see if there are common understandings between the academics and policymakers. The other, maybe more intellectually challenging task is whether there could be common responses that would involve both top-down interventions, so working with political elites, with those holding power in crisis areas, but also involving people affected that usually do not have voice in interventions. And in context of this last question, it's my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker for the 8th Belgrade Security Forum's academic event. It's Professor Roger McGinty of Durham University. He's professor in defense, development, and diplomacy. So it sounds like a typical high politics, old-fashioned strategic issues professor. But I can promise you from reading his papers, he's everything but that. And he tries to answer a very challenging question in today's discussion. And this is, who is the local that we claim should be listened to when intervening in foreign countries to introduce peace? Whose voices are missing, how it could be done, especially how it could be done in a highly polarized context. I'll give example close to home of Kosovo. who would be the local, who should be involved in coming up with comprehensive normalization solutions? Are those only both Kosovo Serbs and Albanians living in Kosovo, or also the IDPs that are in other parts of the region, or just political elites? Which parts of the local population are actually the local, and how should they be involved? Professor McGinty is going to give a presentation on it, but I just want to say that he's already not just writing theoretical pieces, but has initiated one of practical tools to implement what he's preaching, and that is Everyday Peace Indicators initiative that looks what peace actually means by those that should live in it. So not experts, academics, politicians, but how the local population defines what is security or stability or peace in everyday life of them. So I hope he is going to give also example of this in his presentation. Without further ado, I would ask Professor McGinty to take the floor.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for the kind words, Sonia. Thank you, BSF. I note that I'm a peace studies scholar. This is a security event. I note where the exits are, so I'll make a quick exit if things go wrong. I also didn't get the memo about wearing the dark suit. I don't own one, so that's a bit of a problem. Let me start with a story. I was at a conference about 5 or 6 years ago in a large Asian country in which there are a number of conflicts. And at the conference, there were the usual boring academics like me, and there were a few local activists. And also at the conference was someone from the EU delegation to that country. And the local activist, sometime at the end of the first day, stood up and asked the question to the person from the EU delegation, how do we talk to the EU? And he went on, he said, I represent weavers, hand-loom operators, and they have great difficulty exporting their goods. They don't get a fair price because of tariff system and also because of the EU dumping cheap produce in this country. And the very nice guy from the EU delegation said, well, it's easy. Once a month in the capital city, we have a forum in which we have an umbrella organization of NGOs from your country, and we meet with them on a monthly basis. So what you have to do is you have to register in your country as an NGO. You have to then join this organization, this umbrella organization. Then you have to make sure that you're chosen by that organization for that monthly meeting, and the topic is germane for that date, and then you travel to the capital city. And the local activist on the floor, who by the way was called Lenin, said, I don't think you quite understand how difficult that is, how this process of registration is difficult, how the organization, the umbrella organization of NGOs actually won't recognize us because they don't like our politics because of the divisions in this country. And also the capital city is over 1,000 kilometers away. Now, the guy from the EU delegation was trying his best and giving what he thought was a good answer. But I think the story illustrates the difficulty that the international has in reading, and indeed vice versa. And that's what I would like to talk about today. I have a PowerPoint, and I have a 1-minute paper. So you can tune in for the 1 minute, and then if you think this is going to be really, really dull, get onto your tablet or laptop and tune out. So what I want to talk about are levels of analysis. How do we read the local, the national, the international, the transnational, and all levels in between? How do we do that practically and intellectually? I want to make the point that what we refer to as the local often isn't what we think it is. I'll come back to that in a minute. I want to also say that when international organizations use the term local, often they mean national, or often they mean municipal or city. And then towards the end of the paper, or the second half, I want to talk about how in my own research I've been attempting to find out what this local is. And I'm sure many of you in this room have engaged in similar journeys and have come to possibly similar or possibly different conclusions. So let me get back to this issue of the local. No one lives a Serbian life. I realize there are a lot of you in this room. Many of you have military training. I don't. But really, Serbia and any other country you wish to imagine or wish to choose is an imaginary. Yet we have the fiction that someone, a foreign minister or whatever, an ambassador, apologies if there are any in the room, is representing a country. Not only does no one live a Serbian life, no one leads a Belgrade life. No one leads a life that somehow encapsulates Belgrade. In actual fact, the lives that we lead are hyper-local. They're very local. They're micro-local. They are lives of particular networks, family networks, friendship networks, lives of particular routes, of buses, of trams, of where's my parking space, and I have to get in extra early because that person in the Audi always tries to park there on the end parking space, and I need to get into work before they do. We have a life that revolves around our favourite cafe, our favourite coffee shop, of kindergartens, of schools, of social activities. The point that I'm making is that the local is highly individualized and highly personalized. It is a life of embodiment and enactment. It is a very familiar life. That, to me, is the local. And thus, when people talk about the local being a city, like Belgrade, with 1.8 million people, I think that's fiction. I think that's absurd. And when international organizations talk about the local as being anything sub-state, again, I think that's absurd. So what I want to do in this paper is say something about defining the local, to chart the rediscovery of the local, to make this point or reinforce this point that the local actually is incredibly local. It's very local. I haven't quite found the right superlative to put in front of local to illustrate this point. Maybe you can help me out. And then finally, I want to say how through my own research I've been attempting to access the local. So then, how do we define the local? Well, yes, it is a place. Yes, we can find it on the map. Yes, it is a noun. But it's also a verb. It's something that's enacted, embodied, lived. We give it life through our daily activities. I think it's important we try to see the local in its own right. Now, that's a really difficult thing to do, because when we have a concept, we immediately try to relate it to something else. Ah, the local. We'll put this in the context of the global or the national. But as I want to illustrate later on, people tend not to see the world according to the national or the international or transnational. They see it in terms of the local, in its own right. The local is networked, incredibly networked, particularly nowadays, but look at history and how well networked we were centuries ago, millennia ago. The local is full of institutions. It's highly institutionalized, but not institutions of states or municipalities, institutions of family, of church, of social activity. It's worth thinking about it divorced from geography in an extraterritorial way, as a way removed from the strictures of territory. Remember just how mobile ideas and people can be in our transnational world. We also tend to think of the local often as being somehow backward, off the beaten track, under the radar, somehow anti-modern. It's not. What it has is a different form of modernity. And just because it's different from capital city modernity, just because it doesn't have WhatsApp or Uber or whatever, it's still a modernity, but a different one than ours. And I might suggest, very often, a more civilized one. And the key point is that the local is incredibly local. It revolves around the home, the workplace. It revolves around the apartment building, the route that we take to school or work, the bakery, etc., our favorite cafe. Okay, so over the long period of history, something quite interesting has happened to the local. In a sense, if you think of state-building exercises over history or colonial and empire building exercises, that has been about civilizing the local, making the local understandable. The local was regarded as being backward, as being unintelligible, as being poor, as a site of resistance. In more modern times, as being a haven for terrorists. They use something dreadful called asymmetric warfare, meaning they're not as strong as states. They are uncivilized. And the remedy to that is to civilize the local, is to give them names. Look at the map of the Pacific and how there are islands like New Caledonia or New Scotland, etc., etc. But more recently, the local has been rediscovered. I should say that there is one group of people who never forgot about the local, who always remembered how important the local was, and that is the counterinsurgency people. And if you take a look, for example, I stumbled, if anyone is an academic, a fact of life is that you go to the library and you find in the unintelligible catalogue system where the book that you actually want is, and you only go to the library once every 2 months because it's just full of students, and the last people you want to see in your daily existence are students. So you go really early in the morning, and you go to where the book is after a good 10-minute workout of finding where it is, and you find the space where the book should have been. But usually the books on the other side are fascinating. And I found myself reading, unplanned, military reports from the US military in the 1890s from the Philippines, reporting from the pacification of the Philippines. This was classic counterinsurgency, all about understanding the local. It could have been Kilcullen in the last decade. It was wonderful stuff. So The coin people haven't overlooked the local. But more recently, a lot of international organizations have got religion late. They've rediscovered the local. And the local is the route to legitimacy. If we get local partnership, local buy-in, local consent, then we will have legitimacy. We will be authentic. We're talking their language. We will be sustainable. Our programs and projects will be resilient. And crucially, the local ultimately is an exit strategy. It allows the intervention to end if there is local buy-in, if we have local stakeholders. And it's quite well illustrated by this table. If you see on the table, these are, in a sense, the major international peace-building documents in the modern era. And interestingly, Agenda for Peace from 1992, often regarded as the keystone document in peace-building, doesn't mention the word local. It's not there. But then if we fast forward a decade or two, this word local is like confetti. It's everywhere. The ratio of the word local to page number is quite remarkable. We're tripping over the word local. It's almost the prefix to every other word in the document. And what I want to suggest is often this use of the word local is quite shallow. It doesn't have much substance. Even NATO has discovered the word local. It's everywhere in its documents. And you can play this game at home. You can choose the European Union website or UNDP website and type in the word local. And it crops up everywhere. And then if you look at older documents, it's not there. So everybody's discovered this word local. And I guess we're all struggling to work out what it means. And the way that I have attempted to do that is through a research project called Everyday Peace Indicators. And I want to explain what we've been doing in this. So Everyday Peace Indicators is a research project that is conducted by myself and Pamina Fershau at George Mason University. And the USP of this project is to crowdsource bottom-up indicators of peace, conflict and change from community members themselves. So if you think about a standard indicator project from an international organization or from academics, it involves as a starting point pointy-headed academics like me sitting in a seminar room working out what the indicators for another population should be. And then we get our list of indicators and we travel 6,000 kilometers to somewhere else. We drive for 3 hours. We go into a local community and say, these are your indicators. Can you tell me the extent to which these indicators conform to your life? And people look at us and think, why? Why should I do that? So our thought was, why don't we just go and ask people what their indicators would be? How do you notice in everyday life what the indicators of peace and change are? Let me give you an example. I grew up in Northern Ireland, which had a very small but very bitter civil war. Now, everybody in the United Kingdom eats their food from one dreadful supermarket called Tesco. Everybody hates Tesco with a passion. Everybody shops at Tesco. Now, during the violence in Northern Ireland, Tesco didn't open in Northern Ireland. They were risk averse. Our money wasn't good enough for them. 1994, there were ceasefires at the beginning of a peace process. Tesco opened in every town. That was an indicator of peace. And we didn't predict that. And we couldn't have predicted that. We couldn't have predicted these little everyday changes that changed how we lived, that changed how we saw peace and measured peace. Oh, there's another Tesco opening. And this was an indicator of business confidence. So with the everyday peace indicators, we have organized this in Zimbabwe, South Africa, Uganda, and Colombia, in communities, in rural and urban communities, in communities that received quite a lot of peace building, and communities that received not very much peace building intervention. We used participatory research methods. We asked people what their indicators of peace and change were. We then, through focus groups, we then turned this into surveys, and we used survey material to try and track everyday peace in people's own language, using the vernacular. So, for example, in many communities, the #1 indicator of insecurity is the barking dog. The barking dog is a sign of prowlers. Many of these communities suffer from post-war crime. So if the dogs are barking, there are people about. I'm going to stay at home. And you can imagine the scene. Some years ago, I managed to wangle my way into the World Bank headquarters in Washington, D.C. And I was talking to a very nice person, a proper economist, who was working on top-down indicators of change and security. So she came from an econometric background. I was talking to her about barking dogs. If this poor woman had a panic button to call security and get me escorted from the building, she would have been well within her rights. The point is that the way that international organizations read peace and security is very different from the way that local communities read that. And we need to think of ways that we can get these indicator systems to talk to one another. So this is us. This is my colleague, Pamina Fershau. We're conducting focus groups. And one of the key findings of this research was how local people interpreted peace and security. We hadn't anticipated that people would read peace and security in quite so local a way. It was all about the home and the immediate vicinity of the home. I won't read the quotations on the PowerPoint simply because I can't see them from here. But they're all about, is it safe for me to go to the bus stop? Is it safe for my kid to walk to school? One of the key ones was, is it safe for me to use the latrine outdoors in Uganda? Most people would use a latrine outdoors. If you feel unsafe at night, you stay indoors. Or if you feel that peace is here to stay, you might invest in your property. You might paint it. You might put in new glazing or whatever, or a new roof. The key point is that people interpret the local in an extraordinarily local way. Yet, quite clearly, this is nested within a wider politics, a wider security system, a global political economy. So consider the man in the picture. He's called Ignatius. He's living about 200 kilometers north of Cape Town. He's in a valley. The bottom of the valley is beautiful and verdant and fertile. It has vineyards. And dotted at the bottom of the valley are these white villas, the vineyard owners. Ignatius doesn't live there. He lives on the side of the valley in a relatively new house that was built post-apartheid. but a very cheaply built house. For Ignatius, the key issues in his life are the immediate security of his home and his family. His world is the township, is the few streets that he lives in. He hasn't travelled in life. He used to work in the vineyards. He lives essentially quite a local life. But quite clearly, that local life is nested within a much broader geopolitical environment, within a much broader political economy that many of us are implicated in. If, like me, you like a glass of South African wine, followed by the rest of the bottle, we're implicated in his story. Because his story is very much about the political economy of apartheid, which has been long-lasting. His story is very, is very much about the wine industry, but it's also about the transnational gangs, about the drugs and the guns that are coming in. So although he sees his life in a highly local way, it is actually implicated in a much broader story. And the research question that I have is, how do we connect these two? And another, as an aside, let me share something with you. We all have our vices. We all have our secrets. We all might eat too much or drink too much or enjoy smoking something that's illegal or whatever. We all have our vices. My vice, I'm going to reveal. I read war memoirs. I read pulp non-fiction. These are first-hand accounts, usually from World War I or World War II. And I have to tell you, the vast majority of them are utterly dreadful. These are the very people who should never write books because often they have no literary skills whatsoever. But they are a wonderful resource because these people were there. They were first-hand, they were raw. Often these are diaries. They wrote these more or less in the heat of battle or heat of war. They're fantastic. And I have hundreds of these, and it's my no longer secret vice. But one thing that comes out of these, again and again, is the localism. These stories are about where they're sleeping tonight, food, bed bugs, and their small group of mates. It really is about the foxhole. It really is about the band of brothers. It is incredibly gendered, this literature, I have to say. Yet, all of these stories are hosted within a much broader geostrategic story. And it's encapsulated in a wonderful quotation, which I'm not going to be able to read because I can't see it, from George MacDonald Fraser. Now, he was cheating in writing a war memoir. He served in the British military in Burma in World War II. He was cheating because he went on to become a very successful novelist. So he had wonderful literary skills. But what the quotation says is that war is not about red and blue arrows on a map. It is not about the big strategy. It's about my small group of mates and our sore feet. It's about the pack we had to carry. And it's about the absurdity of my personal experience in warfare, where every so often one of us falls down a hill or falls down a hole or a well and they have to be rescued. And I guess the issue is, how do we connect these micro stories, the local, with the international? And the discipline, the larger discipline that I come from, international relations, still suffers from this. It is state and institution focused. Still, people talk about decolonizing international relations. It's still largely colonized. It still largely talks about states and institutions. And that's fine. But the point I'm making is, very few people live a state-centric life. Very few people live their lives through institutions. Very often the local is not taken seriously. My story of the barking dogs and the World Bank, I think, illustrates that. So to talk about the local is quite critical, but we have to be careful. The language that we use as critical scholars often can be conceited and very far removed from people's actual lives. Look at quantitative renderings of peace and conflict, where the answer to everyone's conflict is 0.2 to the power of 7. Yeah. Or look at post-colonialist literature, which is impenetrable very often. Indeed, international relations as a discipline has perpetrated a dreadful crime against the lexicon by coining the term ontological security. I mean, academics like me have conducted millions of interviews collectively, millions of interviews and focus groups. Never, ever in the history of any of those focus groups or interviews has anyone said, well, the situation in the town is deteriorating and I'm quite worried about my ontological security. Yet, we use this term like confetti, so we have to be very careful about this. The key point, I guess, is how do we contextualize these local stories? How do we try to make sense of them? And I want to finish in a few minutes by saying the way that I'm attempting to do this, and there are lots of other ways, is using network theory, but a variation of this. And I quite like the notion of circuitry, both biological circuitry and engineered circuitry, not just as a metaphor, but as an analytical device to connect the very local with the structural, with the international, with the transnational, and all levels in between. Circuits are good, particularly biological circuits, because they remind us of the need for humility in research. There have been massive advances in neurosciences in recent decades, but we still don't understand how the human brain works. I don't understand how Mrs. McGinty's brain works, but she tells me that it's working in perfect order and I must obey. So we need humility as a starting point, and circuitry, I think, is a good way of reminding us that. Circuits are all about movement and dynamic. They're about the movement of ideas, of people, of power, of energy. They require an infrastructure. And if you have an infrastructure, you have power, you have organization, you've got the material power to build and maintain, to plan, to accumulate resources. They also require agency. And if you've got agency, you've got room for alternatives. You've got room for subversion. You've got room for that different narrative, for resistance, for the hidden transcript. So imagine the small group of people as being the family or the individual, as being one of the points in that network, on that circuit board. And that point, that little node, is then encapsulated in a larger network and a larger network and a larger one that factors up to those big institutions that control and make decisions on our behalf. Also, we can think of circuits within circuits, the individual, the family, the small group, or a micro-circuit within a larger circuit. And then finally, we can think of circuits of different orders, different types of circuits nested together. So just to conclude, what I've been doing, I hope, is thinking through what we mean by this term local and making the point that the local often is much more local than we were led to believe. It is, in a sense, micro-local. And thinking through ways we can try to read that, try to access that. Thinking about issues of scale, and indeed thinking about the absurdity of the scale that we have normalized, the national, the international, that claims to speak on behalf of very many people, and how removed that is from the everyday life of going to the local bakery and bringing the kids to school along the normal route. So I am more than happy to attempt to answer questions and probably to defer questions with the stock answer of, that's really interesting, but what do you think? So thank you. Excellent. Please.
Okay. Well, it seems that your So, is this on? Can you guys hear me? So if I understand correctly, it seems as if your approach is shifting away from quantitative analysis and more towards anecdotal evidence. How do you aggregate that data effectively, and how do you deal with the interpretive liberty that some people may exercise over this data?
Sorry, could you repeat just the last?
How do you control for the interpretive liberty that some people may exercise when interpreting this data and communicating it to other people?
Okay. I think what we have to do is, with all research, quantitative, qualitative, is accept that societies, particularly societies affected by conflict, are not laboratories. Now that's quite difficult because it leads us towards the notion of good enough research. And as social scientists, we have to strive for robustness. We have to try and say that our research is going to be replicable. Yet, when I go to conduct research in faraway countries, and indeed in local countries, often everything goes wrong. The taxi doesn't turn up, I get quite spectacular bed bugs, I feel sick, I'm going to record an interview on my phone, and the battery runs out, and the nearest place I can recharge is 50 kilometers away. So we've got this balance between attempting to have scientific robustness and the fact that I, at least, as a researcher, have feet of clay, that I get things wrong. And therefore, I think the answer, in a way, is to be honest and say that this is what our data tells us. This data is prone to all sorts of error, mistakes, and it's highly localized. And then, as you mentioned, how do you aggregate that data from an extraordinarily local pinpoint and say this represents anything other than the locality? And what we see with the Everyday Peace Indicators project is we see this as being complementary to other forms of data gathering, some of which may be quantitative, others qualitative. We see it as bringing greater nuance. We see it as enlivening narrative by allowing local voices to be in this. But I think that, you know, the way as researchers that we should strive towards is towards interdisciplinary collaborative research in which there are multiple data points telling the same story, in the hope that if we triangulate, if we look at these together, then we can get a more accurate picture. Because I'm pretty sure from my disciplinary silo of international relations that we don't have all the answers. But I'm equally sure that other disciplines don't have the answers as well. And I think you know, in a sense, the way that we can get towards some depiction of reality is by listening to the local and by comparing notes. Please.
Hello. Thank you very much for most interesting talk. My name is Vsevolod Samokhvalov. I'm professor at the Free University of Brussels, working on Balkan Eastern Partnership countries. I could easily subscribe to many things that you've highlighted, especially the whole theme. At the same time, in your conversation, you somehow mentioned that all this local context and dynamics is nested or inscribed into broader geopolitical or political economic conditions. So I was wondering, while you push, and well, rightly so probably, this local insight, how would you see, in terms of scholarly research, an interaction between sort of big structural factors like political economy, geopolitics, etc., and this local everyday condition? Any example would be more than welcome. Thank you.
Okay, well, in my own work, how I've attempted to do that is through life histories from people like the man I showed, Ignatius, an attempt to connect that to value chains. And through value chains, we can connect with the strategic, with the global, with the transnational. And also in other parts of research that I've been working on, we attempt to get the everyday peace indicators to talk with other indicator systems that are top-down, that take cognition of the strategic, of the international, of the formal, in a way. So again, it is attempting to meld, to fuse together different epistemological approaches, different methodological approaches, so that we can try and get towards a more accurate picture of the social environments we operate in. Yeah. Please.
Thank you. Kurt Bassiner, Democratization Policy Council, also the University of St. Andrews, a PhD student there. It was a fascinating presentation, and the thought that I had coming from my experiences, have you been looking into the political representation of this deep locality or the hyper-local that does that come up in your research, or is that something that you're thinking of moving forward, how these people would be represented at higher levels?
Funny, I was at St. Andrews last week, and I saw students playing Quidditch, which is this game from Harry Potter. I've never seen anything more ridiculous in my life. It was like people who don't like sport playing sport. It was fascinating. But more seriously, your question. When we embarked on the Everyday Peace Indicators project, one of my fears was that when we asked people to tell us what peace looked like to them, that they would merely repeat what they had heard a political leader say on the radio last night, or read in the newspaper that day, or whatever. And interestingly, they didn't. Very few did, some did, but very few. So I thought it was interesting that we got what I would like to think would be a vernacular, would be a highly localized impression of peace and change. But then, how do we represent that up the chain to political leaders? Well, in the current phase of the Everyday Peace Indicators project, we're attempting to run a number of institutional ethnographies. So finding out what the local is saying and thinking is quite difficult, but we've done it. And many others have done it. I should say that Everyday Peace Indicators project borrowed heavily from other methodologies, so I'm not claiming wonderful originality. But that's only part of the equation. What happens when that local information moves up through organizations? How is it edited, parsed, ignored, aggregated? And to do that, to try and trace that data, we're currently conducting institutional ethnography in a organization for victims set up as part of the Colombian peace process. So how does highly sensitive, very localized information turn into one page on the minister's desk? That process is one of power, of editorial decisions. And it strikes me as that's where the answer to the question is. How is the local rendered towards when it reaches the top of institutions? And very often what happens is, with the change of scale, people stop talking about the local and they talk about the national. And thus, we talk about the war in Colombia. Well, actually, the war in Colombia, the FARC government war, was actually highly localized in many ways. It obviously had national dynamics and ramifications, but where the kinetic end of that conflict was, often was highly localized, yet the one-pager for the minister might refer to a national picture. And I think it's that sleight of hand, if I can call it that we're interested in. So maybe in a year's time, I might be able to give you a more certain answer. Please.
I'll be very short. What and how do you see are there any practical solution in mismatching the needs and issues related from for example, you mentioned the bank indicators and the needs on the field. I had a chance to work in Africa, let's say in Kenya and Somalia. So I do understand that the EU and other global players having their own mechanism in doing that. So did you have chance, or do you have knowledge, what are the practical solutions in doing this?
Practical solutions.
Practical solutions in basically in balancing and reaching the local needs, in comparing them with, I would say, the superficial, for example, mechanism that the players such as EU, UN, bank, and other organizations do have.
I think that is in a sense, the unicorn under the rainbow. That's where we're all trying to get to. And I think the way we do that is for international organizations, INGOs, as much as they can, to try and first think about what they mean by the local. Is the local always on the main road? Does the local always look like us? In other words, it's an NGO. It seems unlikely to me that the local is always the low-hanging fruit, those communities we can get to most easily. And a lot of academics and a lot of journalists, and I have to say a lot of policymakers and practitioners do access the local and are very good at it. We hear of people who, in a sense, have gone local. And that is regarded as being pejorative. And I think, in actual fact, good for them, because they speak the language. Maybe they've married into the country. I mean, in 2013, in the British Embassy in Kabul, a grand total of one person spoke Pashtun. And I suspect that might be replicated in other embassies there. So I think it's not rocket science to try to connect with the local. A lot of people are doing it. I think the missing link is, how do you represent that in a way that is somehow authentic, that is respectful, that is sensitive? And, the other people who do this, and do this particularly well, are military organizations. They call it patrolling. And as someone who grew up in Northern Ireland, and very regularly found soldiers in my back garden, they were engaged in a deep ethnography. I would have preferred that they didn't have guns when I was playing, but still they were engaged in an ethnography. They were embedded not in communities or with communities, but embedded in a locality. So I think we have those skills. I guess it just takes time, it takes money, it's costly in terms of investment. And I think I think the most important thing is to think through what we as scholars, as practitioners, as policymakers might mean by this term local, and maybe get over the fiction that it's actually just subnational or just a municipality. The local, as I see it, is hyper-local. I'll go with you, Sonia.
Thanks. I just wanted to repeat the question, which local are we listening to? If the local voices have diverse versions of what is peace. I'll give example close to home. We did field research on bridge that is supposed to connect the Mitrovica region, and for one community the peace would be to cross it freely, for the other one would be to have it closed forever, probably. Although they're all crossing the bridge, which is 200 meters below, so.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I know the bridge, and just, I don't know north or south, but just along from the bridge there's a footbridge, and what you see is people from the north crossing over to the market because the food is cheaper, the selection is better, and carrying the shopping bags over. This was some years ago, avoiding the bridge watchers at one end. Now, to me, that's the local, because it's embedded, it's every day. That local is about shopping, it's about lunch and dinner. So to me, that is the local that as researchers, as policymakers, we need to keep an eye on. It's the local that is embodied and enacted. It is the local that is the verb rather than the noun. So my answer would be sociological and anthropological. It's how we live the local rather than what we or others say it might be. Yes, please.
Well, it seems as if your hyperlocalism is open to the critique that it's not feasible at a mass scale. You use the case example of counterinsurgent programs, but those are resource intensive and they are only feasible because they have very limited temporal and geographic scopes. Additionally, when you use your case example of patrols in Northern Ireland, it seems as if hyperlocalism requires a certain invasion of privacy in order to succeed. How would you respond to these critiques?
Well, I think what you mean, accessing that hyperlocalism, seeing that hyperlocalism. We live hyperlocalism. We are it, we embody it, we enact it. But actually seeing it, surveilling it, accessing it, capturing it, yes, is resource intensive. And we can't have a one-to-one researcher to civilian ratio. It would be a bit creepy if each of us was followed by an ethnographer at all times. And that's why with, for example, the Everyday Peace Indicators Project, but many, most other social scientific research, we see it as sample research. So we see our research as attempting to see what one locality looks like, and then with a lot of caveats and a lot of caution, trying to factor that up and to see if we can factor it up. And we're conducting some experimental quantitative work at the minute, drawing from social psychology, to see statistically if we can factor up one locality to a bigger scale. And of course, there are all sorts of problems with that, so I don't want to overclaim on that point. But I go back to my last answer, which is we see this in conjunction. We should see these attempts to capture the local in conjunction with all of those other methods that are open to us. We just need a more, I would suggest, a more accurate and a more local reading of the local with that. Yeah.
How do you compare your work with journalism?
Journalism is better. Well, I mean, as well as the flippant answer, one of the things that academia really faces a problem is the crisis of access. So there are entire swathes of this planet where academics do not have access to because of security. It's very difficult for someone like me. In fact, I wouldn't attempt to go to Syria or Yemen, parts of Colombia. Journalists do that, and particularly local journalists. And I think local bloggers and journalism is just the most wonderful resource that we have to celebrate. And it's often overlooked. And weirdly within academia, the term, oh, that's very journalistic, is pejorative, is seen as being an insult. And I think, no. Many of these journalists have done the most amazing things. So I think, you know, I look up to a lot of journalism and recognize the immense bravery that a lot of reporters undertake, particularly in this day and age when, as we know, with the murderous Saudi regime's actions recently, how journalists are under threat. Yeah, please.
Popovic, Nansen Dialogue Center Serbia. This is the network and network of civil society organizations. So key question for me, what you just asked, how to pass all these local messages from the ground to the decision makers, whoever they may be. Because there is no lack of local information. We work precisely in local communities like North Mitrovica or Bujanovac or I don't know, different parts. Also member of bigger network, GPAC, my colleague here is Global Partnership for Prevention of Armed Conflict. And we do invest efforts in strengthening local population to do exactly that, to pass the messages, to be resilient to different type of conflict situations. Resilience not enough, basic security not enough. So what are your ideas how to be heard more loudly and how to pass these messages in timely manner? Because of course there are early warning systems, there are a million thematic groups and I don't want to mention them all. Or if you have got some examples, how to be faster actually with sending these information to relevant decision makers. Thank you.
I agree with you. I really don't think there is a shortage of information, particularly in this day and age, nor indeed is there, are we challenged as much as we were by time. You know, Twitter is instantaneous. So I think that the mechanisms are there. If I can say something quite critical and then avoid you for the next 2 days, I would like to...
You want to escape, but no.
I would like to draw a distinction between civil society, organizations, and the local. There is an overlap, but very often civil society organizations are an elite within the community. I'm not saying all are, and I'm sure your network is not. But the localism that I am talking about doesn't have an office. It doesn't have a building. It doesn't apply for grants. It doesn't use the language of resilience and sustainability and early warning. It gathers around a kitchen table. It gathers around a cafe table. It queues at the post office. And I think it's that local that I'm more interested in. Of course there is an overlap between that and civil society organizations, but they are not precisely the same thing. How can they be heard? I think that in a sense, very often the onus is on the local to be heard. I wonder why.
Because of the power imbalance?
Exactly. Why is the onus not on institutions to read the local better? They are often the ones with the surveillance technologies. They are the ones with the networks and the institutions with the material power. So I guess a way of not answering your question is to turn it around and say, well, you know, that's a question for those in institutions who, it has to be said, live their own local lives within institutions, and indeed as individuals and persons, as human beings. So they're not removed completely from the local. Only the absolute elite who live in the bubble are removed from everyday life of filling out forms to tax your car. Everyone has to do that. Yeah. Okay, yeah, yeah, I agree. Thank you all very much for your patience. Thank you.
mašio sasvim okej ovako.
Okay. Yeah, it's fine. Sorry, we are starting because we are already short in time. So, Your Excellencies, distinguished participants, dear ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for coming to the first in the series of hopefully interesting and vibrant discussions at this year's Belgrade Security Forum. My name is Tijana Rečević, and I'm a junior researcher and a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Political Sciences here in Belgrade. And I got the honor to moderate one of the academic panels dedicated to the overarching topic of EU crisis response. So in their insightful and inspiring welcoming and keynote speeches, Ms. Stojanović-Gajić and Professor McGinty have already reflected on some of the key academic and policy debates surrounding the current state of EU crisis response efforts, particularly emphasizing the so-called local turn, which has been an orthodoxy in the peace building and international interventionism for over a decade now. So at this panel, I will try to provide some additional conceptual clarifications regarding the EU crisis management and conflict management toolkit, but most of all, we'll try to provide empirical support to the debates mentioned by the previous speakers and to give some fresh thoughts on whether the EU is on its way to accomplish or abandon the aim which it is stated in its last global strategy, and that is, I quote, to act promptly to prevent violent conflict, be able and ready to respond responsively but yet decisively to crisis, facilitate locally owned agreements, and commit long-term. So our panelists will try to investigate whether the EU efforts, crisis response efforts, align or collide with the efforts of other major crisis responders, whether the its conflict management capacity is internally coherent and coordinated, but also how it is perceived and received by those whose wording counts the most, and that is the locals themselves. So we have 4 distinguished panelists presenting 4 papers, some of which are written by more co-authors. And Mr. Steven Blockmans is a professor of EU External Relations, Law and Governments at the University of Amsterdam and the head of the foreign policy at the Brussels-based Center for European Policy Studies, one of the leading think tanks and forums for debates on EU affairs. Mr. Jozef Bátora is a professor at the Department of Political Science at the Comenius University in Bratislava and at the International Relations Department at the Webster Vienna Private University. Ms. Mateja is a lecturer at the St. Andrews University in Scotland, where she also co-directs the Center for Global Constitutionalism. She's also a senior research fellow at the Norwegian Institute for Foreign Affairs. Ms. Irena Mnatsakanyan is a PhD student in political science at the Sapienza University at Rome, and also a researcher at the Brussels-based NGO European Armenian Federation for Justice and Democracy. Finally, our distinguished discussant is Professor Zupančič, who is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Social Science at the University of Ljubljana. He's also a principal investigator and the leader of the Slovenian team in the Horizon 2020 project, Repast, Reinventing the Past, anticipating the future. So each of the panelists will have 10 minutes per addressing, and I will be fair, but strict but fair. So please keep your addressing to time. And after all the panelists have spoken, the discussant will have the word to provide a feedback on the papers, but also to reflect perhaps on some broader issues and topics regarding this academic theme. So, and then the word will be given to the audience, and I'm very sure that this discussion will trigger your hopefully challenging questions. So the floor is all yours. Professor Blockmans, I pass the word to you.
Stephen, thank you. Tijana.
Yes.
First of all, it's a pleasure to be back at the Belgrade Security Forum. I look forward to some great days of discussion, and thank you for hosting us. As UN PAC members, project team members, that is, of Horizon 2020 research project, which presents its findings during this academic conference. Now, Roger is a tough act to follow, especially when he brings up his fetishes of reading war memoirs and brings the discussion really down to the local level, whereas the scene setter which I'm about to give is very much a helicopter view on things, and not only focuses on the connection that international organizations have to make with the local dynamics, but also look at three other dynamics which ultimately ought to make up for effective crisis response. And I'll discuss them in just a moment. The paper as such is co-authored with Luce de Buijzer at CEPS for the UN PAC project, and it deals with, it essentially tries and compares the headquarters approaches as to how policymakers in their ivory towers in New York at the UN, in Brussels at NATO and the EU, in Vienna at the OSCE, have tried to come up with issues or conceptions of comprehensive and integrated ways of dealing with external conflicts and crises. And then it tries to match that essentially with some of the key findings from the research which has been done at grassroots level in 6 countries that the project focused on. Kosovo was mentioned, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Mali, and Ukraine. And I think, without trying to spoil, you know, the findings that each of our co-panelists will present to you from the empirical research done on the ground, I think I might offer nevertheless a couple of markers in order to understand the main dynamics that we need to get right. And so what the article does is identify 4 potential difficulties that may arise when integrating levels, tools, and phases of conflict. One is indeed local ownership. But before getting there, in fact, effective conflict analysis and conflict prevention ought to be done with of course, the capacities brought within each of those organizations. Conflict sensitivity, therefore, becomes one of the key words, and in fact was probably the buzzword of our project, and that will resonate, I think, also throughout this panel. A third one would be effective multilateralism, not just between international organizations, but also within their own institutional families, the UN family, the EU family, in particular, as the 2 international organizations that, at least in the 6 countries that we've looked at, cooperate most often together. And then the fourth dynamic would be the balance, the value chain that Roger talked about, the balance that these organizations try to strike between their own enlightened self-interest in intervening in external conflicts and crises, and the values that they try to hold up, and that have, of course, been espoused in their constitutional documents, in their policy documents, etc. And now what you see when you look and compare the comprehensive / integrated approaches that have been developed since 1992 by the UN in its Agenda for Peace, through the implementation of the 2015 HIPPO report, the high-level independent panel on peace operations in the UN context, or if you compare the same by looking at the OSCE's 3 baskets in its constituent document of the Helsinki Final Act in 1975, through to the 40th anniversary documents which were published just a few years ago, if you do the same for NATO, which of course has come from a military background and has moved up to try and join up with civilian actors since 2006 at its Riga summit declaration and through to the implementation of the 2016 Warsaw Summit Declaration, and you set that off against what the EU, a relatively new and ambitious international crisis responder, has been trying to do since 2003 in its European security strategy, down to the current implementation, ongoing implementation of the European global strategy that you mentioned, Tijana, one observes a gradual convergence basically on the conceptual issues of comprehensiveness, of integration, the institutional backup which is needed through key coordinating hubs in the EU, PRISM, policy prevention, crisis response mechanism, basically a hub within the European External Action Service. You see a gradual convergence also in terms of instruments as all of these organizations, maybe with cross dynamics, move towards joining up their civilian and their military components. There is nevertheless, because of the institutional logic in each of those organizations, the membership, of course, and the political contingencies that play out within their institutional and decision-making bodies, these institutional logic pan out differently when these organizations move onto the ground and try effective multilateralism. The EU is, on the basis of our research at least, often the organization that comes in rather late to the game. Often it's either one of their member states that is acted solo already and is on the ground, or the US has done so, or the UN is present, or NATO. And so the EU finds itself often playing second fiddle, coming into theater and trying to match up with whatever it can muster, complementary to what has already been framed by other international crisis responders. Probably Ukraine is one of the better examples where the EU has moved in quite quickly. But even there, as we'll hear, there are serious concerns. So much for effective multilateralism. There, the EU is, of course, held back by its own slow, grinding decision-making procedures. And even if modest steps have been made in recent years to gear up those institutions and facilitate also the mobilization of resources, the EU is still very late, often in the game. So as far as cooperation with international partners is concerned, I think ineffective multilateralism is in fact the reality that we're still looking at for the EU, even if it is aware of the problem and trying to do its best. As far as conflict sensitivity is concerned, and again this will resonate much more clearly with the other paper givers, I think the empirical evidence which has been gathered from Libya, Afghanistan, Mali and Iraq shows that that conflict sensitivity is only a sullenly accepted but often completely neglected concept in practice. In fact, some of our researchers, having gone around with their microphones in Brussels asking civil servants about the concept, were met by blank stares, which says a lot in itself. Especially in Libya, and we'll hear that later, the EU is being blamed for a lack of conflict sensitivity, and certainly when compared to other international actors operating on the ground, in fact having aggravated through some of its actions the root causes for that have spurred conflict in and around the country. Thirdly, the dynamic of local ownership, and I'm coming to close, Tijana, which is a recurring problem in both the EU and other multilateral actors' crisis response, is the lack of convergence, basically, between the interests and preferences of domestic actors. Roger was looking for a term, incredibly local. He in the end came up with hyper-local, I think, as a concept. And the connections that need to be made with the international interveners. And on top of that, a difficult balance that needs to be found between conflict sensitivity and that local ownership as cooperation with local, but yet corruptible, if not already corrupt, or ineffective actors may aggravate the crisis or conflict and undermine peace-building efforts that the EU and other international organizations are trying to achieve. And then finally, the examples of Libya, of Ukraine and Mali, 3 cases which, because of the migration dimension that they have in them, are indicative of the kind of challenges which are bound to dog the EU for years to come, especially with the very narrow focus that the EU has adopted on externalizing border management and security rather than front-loading tackling the root causes of the conflict. Is that narrow focus is in fact thwarting the Union's self-proclaimed commitment to an actual integrated approach to conflicts and crises. And so in spite of the continuing rhetoric by some of the figureheads of the European Action Service, the EU institutions, their spin doctors, that rhetoric about the promotion of human rights, respect for democratic values, these normative concerns have in fact progressively faded in policy documents. See the global strategy and its introduction of a very confusing term or phrase, principled pragmatism, where more pragmatic security and stabilization imperatives in fact now feature center stage, effectively thereby subordinating the EU's role as a transformative power. It's certainly its credibility as a transformative power and affecting thereby its effectiveness on the ground, certainly when compared to less interest-driven and more value-based actors like the UN. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. And also thank you for in a way, setting the stage for the rest of the panelists, both in a conceptual and empirical way. Professor Bátora, the word is yours.
Thank you, Tijana. Dobar dan, srećan sam što se vidimo ponovo u Beogradu. It's great to be back in Belgrade. This is my 3rd time in Belgrade, 2nd time at the forum. The paper that I'm going to present in these next 10 minutes or so is a paper that we wrote together as part of the EU Unpack project, together with Kari Oslan and Florian Kehaja from the Kosovo Center for Security Studies. And we are also very grateful for the support and collaboration of Sonja Stojanovic and her team at the Belgrade Center for Security Studies. What we were looking at in the paper is the local perceptions of the European Union as a crisis management actor. And what we wanted to find out is to what extent in a post-conflict setting such as Kosovo do perceptional identity boundaries translate into differences in how people perceive the European Union as a conflict management actor. So what we did, this is based on empirical research in Mitrovica, both north and south. We did survey of local citizens, 208, approximately 100 on each side. And then also it's based on surveys of households in Kosovo. But a little bit about the conceptual framework first. So when you're thinking about the European Union and when you're studying the European Union as a normative actor in international affairs, there are studies of perceptions of the European Union by non-European societies. There's quite a literature on that. There are also studies about the perceptions of policy impacts of the European Union in international negotiations. Also, there are studies about the European Union's own perceptions of its own role as a normative power. We have a gap in the literature, however, on how local populations perceive the European Union when it engages as a crisis management actor. And this is pretty important, actually, in terms of its ability to be the stabilizing actor that it sees itself as being, to be the normative power or the transformative power that it tries to be. Question, of course, is about the level of ambition here. Is it a transformational power or actually a stabilizing actor? But it doesn't matter. Either way, the effectiveness of that really depends on how people perceive the European Union. Some work on this has been done by colleagues. Florian Kehaja has worked on this, but also your very own Filip Eduš has done some work recently as part of a different EU a different Horizon project. So we're not the first ones to start tackling these issues, but this is a relatively new thing that we have been looking at. What we build on is really this local turn in conflict studies. And I want to give you a quote by Roger McGinty on this. He says, "Many physical boundaries are the product of the boundaries in the mind. They are the manifestation of a perceptual ordering of the world that differentiates between groups. This ordering takes place at the elite, non-elite, and intermediate levels to produce a society-wide meta-ordering. This ordering is often embedded within socio-political, economic, and cultural narratives and accepted as part of the furniture. It is uninterrogated and regarded as the norm. It is likely that the perceptual identity boundaries have a long historical genesis, a function of long-term proximity of populations." So what we tried to find out is to what extent these kinds of perceptual identity boundaries play a role in how the population perceives each other, but of course the European Union as an actor trying to stabilize the situation. So we worked with 3 assumptions in that work. Assumption number 1 was that perceptual identity boundaries between population groups in post-conflict societies translate into differences in perceptions of the EU as a conflict management actor. Assumption number 2, differences in perceptions of the EU across boundaries between population groups in post-conflict societies are maintained by micro-level practices, local social networks, and ideational structures. Assumption number 3, differences in perceptions of the EU across conflict boundaries have implications for the EU's ability to promote stability and act as normative power in post-conflict environments. Now, unfortunately, we're not allowed to use PowerPoint, so I can't show you the numbers in what we had actually found. But if I'm happy, talk to me after the presentation. I'm happy to send you the paper. It's now under review with a journal. But there are several key findings which I can summarize. One is that there are major differences, profound differences, between how the EU is viewed in North Mitrovica, predominantly populated by Kosovo Serbs, as you know, and South Mitrovica, mainly Kosovo Albanians, with the former having considerably more negative attitudes towards the EU than the latter. The second finding is that while, and this is an interesting one, while the Kosovo Albanian population may have relatively positive attitudes towards the EU as such, it has considerably more negative attitudes towards EULEX as a mission. So there is a difference in perceiving EULEX as an instrument, as an organization operating for the EU on the ground, and the EU as more of a political construct. It's also interesting to look at the practices around the bridges in Mitrovica, because while the main bridge, as you know, has become a major symbol of not only attempts at reconciliation, but also a symbol of actual divisions, the other bridge, the railway bridge, has been readily used by most of the population in Mitrovica. One of the reasons we think is, and this is something that Roger also talked about in his talk this morning, there's a shopping mall on the southern side. So people do actually go in and cross the bridges to shop. So what we found was we find support for the first assumption. So there are indeed perceptual identity boundaries between population group in post-conflict societies, and those translate into differences into perceptions of the EU as a conflict management actor. I'll give you 2 examples of some of the numbers we got. We asked the question in North and South Mitrovica, does the EU understand where assistance and support need to go here in Mitrovica? In North Mitrovica, 23 respondents said yes, they do. 67 said no, they don't. South Mitrovica, you had 39 saying yes and 23 saying no. Then we had a question asking what effect did the EU's intervention in the crisis have? North Mitrovica 23 said that it helped to alleviate the crisis, and 27 of them said that it helped to or that it aggravated the crisis. In South Mitrovica, 46 said that it helped, and only 2 actually said that it aggravated the crisis. So, you know, there are major differences, and I could go on with some other numbers and other questions that we asked. So indeed, we do find support for that, for those perceptual identity boundaries do translate into differences into how people perceive the European Union as a conflict management actor. The second assumption, we also found partial support for the assumption about that the boundaries between population groups are maintained by micro-level practices and social networks. Because we see that around the main bridge, we have the bridge watchers, and that bridge is simply, and the attempts there to rebuild and so on are simply being derailed constantly. But on the other hand, micro-level practices also help to bridge these divides, as we see with the railway bridge, which is just a few hundred meters down the river. Then the third assumption is that the differences in perceptions of the EU across boundaries have implications for the EU's ability to promote stability as a normative actor. As you know, in 2016, the EU has donated €1 million to refurbish the main bridge in Mitrovica. This is just an example. And the bridge did not get opened. There were all kinds of issues regarding technicalities, but also there were some barriers being put up on the northern side of the bridge and so on. So, you know, the perceptual identity boundaries seem to have an effect on the EU's ability to stabilize post-conflict societies. As I said, I'm happy to share the paper with those who would be interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for providing some very interesting examples of how these the perceptual boundaries actually not only intersect but mutually reinforce. And I'm very sure that there will be more questions from the audience and an opportunity for you to share some new insights and illustrations to us. Ms. Peters, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tijana. So what I'll try to do right now is essentially build upon what Stephen and Jozef introduced already by focusing on what I would say is the mission that everybody loves to hate, and that's ULEX mission. And this is a study that essentially built on some of the perception studies that we were doing as part of UNPAC, but is also something that was a tiny bit puzzling for us on sort of why is there so much vitriolic hatred towards the mission that is in a lot of ways a flagship mission for the EU. It's a paper that's again co-authored with Kari Oslan, and I think she did the biggest power move by being an author of 2 papers but not being on the stage, sort of the invisible hand behind a lot of the sort of the thinking. So our starting point was essentially looking at sort of the extremely negative perceptions of ULEX, everything from sort of looking at the scandals to every single sort of public perception survey conducted by both local NGOs, by international organizations. There's sort of a uniform consensus coming across that ULEX just doesn't have a good reputation in Kosovo, either among Kosovo Serbs or Kosovo Albanians. At the same time, as I said, it's a very puzzling situation because ULEX is in a lot of ways a flagship mission for the EU. It's the most expensive mission, it's the largest mission that the EU has, and essentially it's also a credibility issue for the EU because if the EU can't do things in the Balkans, what chances does it have to actually influence the rest of the world? At the same time, and this is where sort of some of our thinking then ended up developing on sort of the perception and sort of implementation issues, it's also a unique mission. It's the only mission that the EU has that essentially has an executive mandate. So we have EU judges, prosecutors, customs officers, investigators actually doing some of the work that normally we consider local institutions doing. So the question that we started with is, what is the reason for such bad perception? And is this perception a reflection of actual implementation, or is it sort of just an issue of bad communication on behalf of the EU and sort of misreading of what the EU is actually doing on the ground. And so what we ended up focusing on in this paper is sort of analytically distinguishing between sort of two different gaps. One is the gap of sort of what sort of Stephen was talking about, sort of the policy and then the implementation aspect. Is there sort of a difference between what the EU is saying and what it's actually doing on the ground, what it's saying in its strategies, statements, and so on and so forth, and what the implementers end up doing. And then the other gap that we're kind of seeing is the gap between implementation and perception. So whether there is a difference between what ULEX staff is saying that they're doing, what they're actually sort of implementing, and what the locals are perceiving it. And so what we ended up sort of doing in this paper is looking at the question of how does the mission, or did the mission, balance between sort of the legal work it has to do, sort of sitting on actual cases, investigating sort of very sensitive cases in its sort of docket, and the political objectives that are kind of imbued with the mission, both that the mission is supposed to achieve, sort of the conflict management dimensions and things like that, but also sort of the expectations that the EU has for the mission, right, of what it has to do, and sort of how this balance ends up happening. And so as a first step, we wanted to go sort of beyond the actual data, sort of looking at where sort of the substantive critiques of ULEX come from. So it's not enough just to say we don't like the mission, but we wanted to figure out what were the reasons. And there's kind of 4 reasons that we identify, and these are the reasons that are actually brought out in a lot of the literature on Kosovo already. The first 2, I would actually say, sort of Stephen found a really nice, catchy way of saying it, are the reasons that are essentially where the EU action is framed by others. So it would be regardless of whether it was the EU there or any other actor, it's the nature of the mission that actually, in a lot of ways, damages the perception of the mission. So one of the reasons why we realized, and this was done through both the perception studies and interviews with sort of local representatives, and I will say we did suffer from the problem that we talked mostly with the civil society in this sort of as a translator. So one of the reasons why the mission is perceived in such a negative way has been sort of like high resistance against an EU mission or an executive mission from the start. The mission does go into sort of very sensitive areas, and it's expected. So all of these executive missions, regardless of whether they're UN, EU, or in the case of Iraq, an American mission, have high resistance. So the perception will likely be bad from the beginning. The other thing, the second argument, and this is where we kind of see the EU kind of contributing to the trouble that it has on the ground, is the high expectations gap. Right, so obviously, when you're dealing with an executive kind of a mission, there is an expectation that the mission is going to achieve results. But what didn't help the EU, sort of from the narratives that we got from sort of the local representative, is that the EU, when it kind of opened its present, Europeanized sort of Kosovo in 2008, actually built up the expectations to an incredible degree. And if you look at the statements and the high level of politicians coming to the country, and sort of the region in that era, it's just incredible the amount of stuff that ULEX was supposed to achieve on the ground. The 2 other reasons we found were actually very credible and go sort of to the question of sort of political and legal balance, and were sort of resonated in sort of the implementation discussion. One was this lack of conflict sensitivity that has been alluded to a couple of times already today. And in our particular case, the mission's lack of conflict sensitivity was particularly seen as focus on elites, no broader buy-in, prioritization of other goals, sort of this sort of indirect sort of political interference in the actual legal work of the mission. And the last one, obviously, has been the corruption scandals, which probably all of you in the room know much more than we do. But essentially sort of the idea that there's direct political interference in the work of the mission. So how much is this just a perception, and to what extent do the EU staff working for the mission actually see this resonating with what they're experiencing? And this was sort of the second step of what we were looking at. And what we actually sort of looked at is that essentially the ULEX is in a lot of ways pursuing multiple objectives. And some of the problems coming out of both of the implementers and sort of the perception side was that there's a clear clash of objectives. And so the four objectives that we identified are sort of the conflict management aspect of the mission, then rule of law, then the idea of sort of what Stephen was already referring to, the internal security, is that the mission is actually acting to protect some of the internal concerns of the EU, such as cooperation of transnational organized crime and things like that. And then the last objective, and I think this is something that we often forget, is that the mission is essentially this test of EU global actorness. And so that is an important objective that the EU is pursuing with it. And so we don't like to acknowledge that because we're thinking that the mission is about Kosovo, but in a lot of ways the mission is also about sort of the EU performing in a particular way in it. And that's very much seen in sort of how implementers saw it. So what we ended up doing is we spoke to not a lot of people in the headquarters of ULEX, but did interviews with sort of ULEX judges, prosecutors, people that we don't tend to talk to, but they're actually people that are kind of implementing mission on the day to day. And the interesting thing is that, so it's probably not going to come as a surprise to you that the discussion of sort of direct political interference and corruption scandals and things like that, that most of them thought that this was heavily overblown. And that's not in a lot of ways surprising. But they were readily willing to acknowledge that sort of the EU sort of processes and procedures made sort of the EU handling of these scandals very problematic, and that there was just no way of dealing with them sort of transparently and swiftly because it had to go through the machinery. And so because of that, like, they recognized that very likely there was issues, but because the issues were not dealt swiftly and transparently for internal concerns, these ended up being overblown. However, where we did think that there was some very interesting findings coming out, and it was interesting talking to sort of the prosecutors, judges, sort of the implementers on the ground, there was a very broad consensus that when it comes to ULEX, that they saw EU essentially sacrificing legal work, sort of rule of law priorities, democracy, sort of prosecuting war criminals, corruption scandals, and things like that for other objectives. And there's two ways which we sort of these narratives sort of manifesting itself. One was this clash between sort of what is more important, EU being sort of a global actor and sort of rule of law that concerned the question of sort of structure of ULEX and staffing. And sort of the idea that ULEX is essentially run as a regular CSDP mission, which has a very high turnover, no predictable contracts. And so a lot of them essentially saw that it's a CSDP mission, but at the same time it's a court, right? Or it's an investigative process. And so the comments that we have sort of sprinkled throughout the paper basically say, like, look, how are you going to do a war crimes investigation or a corruption investigation if you're changing an investigator every year or every half a year? So the sort of the idea that the EU was essentially prioritizing its CSDP objectives, sort of the objectives of being a global actor over the rule of law in Kosovo, was very, very stark and as a comment coming out. More importantly for Kosovo itself, I would say, is sort of the balancing act between sort of the conflict management side and the rule of law. And the reason why sort of a lot of ULEX staff actually saw themselves as, in a lot of ways, resigned to the situation is because they essentially saw that the conflict management aspect needed to entail working with elites. While on the other hand, sort of rule of law sort of issues needed to keep these elites accountable, right? And this balancing act was always skewed towards the conflict management stuff. And there's numerous very sort of concrete example of how this impacted their legal work, everything from sensitive cases being reassigned to queries not being answered, to press statements being changed and things like that. So there's a lot of sort of very small, this indirect interference, and a lot of people working on sort of the executive side feeling that the EU, somewhere Brussels, this was the expression Brussels, or the management is essentially prioritizing conflict management over rule of law, which clearly resonated with what is in perception studies. And so just one concluding sentence. And so this is where we kind of came to a conclusion, and we're hoping to look at some of the other cases of whether that might carry in sort of the EU global actors, is that the main reason why the negative perception of ULEX, sort of based on sort of discussion we had, is so high is that the two gaps between policy and implementation and sort of perceptions are much wider because of two interconnected reasons. One is just connected to the nature of the mission, the fact that it's an executive mission. It's supposed to serve as a role model to judges. EU judges are supposed to serve as role model, and actually has authority to deliver, but it doesn't deliver, right? So that's just connected to that fact. And then the other, which is connected to that reason why these two gaps are widened, is because of the proximity of EU engagements, which makes the EU objectives much more pronounced in the region. And so that's our short interventions, trying to bring the top and the bottom together.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation and for helping us understand why the blame the Brussels game is kind of becoming one, if not the only, definitely the most favorite one, not only in Kosovo, I would dare to say, but in the entire region. Thank you very much. Ms. Mnatsakanyan, the word is yours.
Thank you, first of all, for the invitation and for interest in my paper. It's my first time in Serbia, and thanks to the Belgrade Security Forum. And I hope that in the nearest future, in Armenia, we will have an embassy of Serbia, and people can just apply for a visa and see Serbia without waiting for a special invitation. So my paper is about EU engagement in the Southern Caucasus, and I focus on the frozen conflict of South Ossetia, which escalated after the collapse of Soviet Union. And the EU increased the engagement in the region was since 2003, and during which the EU has increased its institutional capacity and introduced many coordination mechanisms. But in spite of its increased engagement in the region, the EU was not able to provide coherent crisis responses to the conflict at both planning and implementation phases of crisis management. So the paper aims to find out why still the EU is incoherent, as it has done so much to improve the coherence of its crisis management since the Single European Act and even after the Lisbon Treaty. It increased its institutional coordination mechanisms. And coherence I define as a well-coordinated process of decision-making. So in this case, coordination is used as a tool to assess coherence. Coherence as a concept is very important in EU external relations, and because in all its official documents, in EU security strategy, in EU comprehensive approach to external conflicts, and in a more recent document, EU global strategy, the EU always mentions about the importance to act coherently and more in an integrated manner to address the external conflicts in its eastern neighborhood. And coordination, so as I use coordination as a tool to assess coherence, empirically I decided to focus on coordination mechanisms that the EU uses in its planning and implementation phases of crisis management. At the planning phase, when there is the planning process of the mission, normally the coordination is done at informal and formal levels. Formal mechanisms are, for example, a crisis platform. There was a crisis response operational coordination department. And informal mechanism could be, for example, joint mission assessments, also EU family meetings, which are organized at horizontal level, and they are chaired by the head of the EU delegation. And the main purpose of this EU family meeting is to improve the share of information at horizontal level between the EU delegations, EU special representative, head of the CSDP mission, so that in the future there don't have any coordination issues. Since 2008, when there was the escalation of the South Ossetia-Georgia war, it resulted in EU-Russia war. And during that time, the EU introduced the additional EU special representative to the region. So there were 2 EU special representatives in the region. One was already appointed in 2006, and then suddenly the Political Security Committee decided to appoint additional EUSR for specific crisis in Georgia, who was the acting EU special representative to Central Asia. So there were 2 EU special representatives in the region, and this situation was not very logical, and it created like overlap of their functions because they were doing the same thing. And there was not an official coordination, first of all, between these 2 actors, and many times they were doing the same, for example, fact-finding mission. It just was very it was very resource-consuming also a situation. And it lasted until 2011, when finally the Political Security Committee decided to merge these 2 mandates into one mandate, USR to South Caucasus and crisis in Georgia. And finally, this kind of approach has made the decision-making process and the mediation more coordinated and therefore more coherent. In general, the coordination task of the EU external relations, and more specifically crisis management, it was given to the High Representative since the Lisbon Treaty. As she is now in the Council, she is in the Commission, and she is in External Action Service. But she, according to the respondents and to some experts, the region Southern Caucasus was not very interesting to her. And it was the Commissioner, Stefan Füle, who was charged in coordinating actually the crisis management in the region. And the High Representative as such, she does not have an enforcement authority on commissioners. And therefore she was not able to foresee the situation. And this situation, the overlap of the mandates between the 2 EUSRs, it lasted until 2011. So some respondents, they said, yeah, it's the fault of the High Representative because the Lisbon Treaty gave her a mandate to coordinate the planning and implementation of the whole EU crisis response. But she was not able successfully to do it in the specific region. Also, there are other cases of problems of coordination which has led to incoherence in EU crisis management. For example, the case when in 2008 there was the EU monitoring mission in Georgia, and the head of the mission was his mandate also allowed him to conduct mediation as the mandate of the EU special representative. But he was not in Geneva discussions, which is the higher level of mediation, and he was not happy that he's not participating in this high level of mediation because his mandate also allows him to conduct mediation. But what kind of mediation? Because there are different levels of mediation at lower level and higher level. So as his mandate was specified very generally, so there was like a tension between the head of the mission and the EU special representative, who was already participating in Geneva talks. And this situation was solved when finally the Political Security Committee decided to include the EU monitoring mission in the Geneva discussions, co-chaired by Russia, OSCE, UN, South Ossetia, and Georgia. So from the EU, it was the head of the mission, EU special representative, participating in the Geneva talks, and this kind of solution solved the problem of coordination, first of all, between the EUSR and EU monitoring mission, because the EU monitoring mission is the only actor at the field which which possesses the information at the administrative border between South Ossetia and Georgia. And he, as such an important actor, was supposed to share this information with the EU special representative, who was supposed to share it with the participants of the mediation process in Geneva talks. So as he was not included in the mediation, he was not happy to share this information. And there were, at some point, some personal tensions between these two actors. So when he was included in the mediation process of Geneva talks, so everything was solved, and the coordination now is very smooth because he's already there in the format. In general, what I want to say that the Lisbon Treaty, although it was supposed to improve the coherence in EU crisis management, at some point it created also some problems, because when, for example, there was the DG Relex, it was in the Commission, and now DG Relex, it is the External Action Service. It created now problem of intra-institutional coherence within Commission. And also the issue of High Representative, for example, the treaty in Article 9, it says that the High Representative is mandated to improve the coherence of crisis management, but it does not specify how High Representative needs to do it, and leaving it just on her wish. And the consequences of this kind of very general approach to coherence we can see in the South Caucasus, and I hope that in the future the treaty will be revised. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for giving us a somewhat different perspective, the intra-institutional one, and also for providing evidence from a different but a very important part of the EU neighborhood. We now give the words to our discussant to reflect on those papers and provide some questions, perhaps, or some of his reflections on the broader theme of our topic.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. It's very good to play a bad cop, to provide some critique to the papers we have heard. But I also looked for fire exits in the case I'll have to run after the panelists hear my comments. I will rather provide some general comments, not individual, as individual comments would be sent to the panelists or have already been sent to them. So all papers more or less directly touch upon the role of EU in post-conflict societies in the EU's near neighborhood, Kosovo, Georgia, Ukraine, whereas one paper, Stevens, also touches upon the EU's role far abroad, so Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Mali, and Ukraine. These sort of, let's say, approaches suggest two things. Either that the EU global strategy and the EU's foreign policy is a very interesting thing to analyze, which I doubt, or that we predominantly focus only on those analyses that have potential for acquiring research funds, so the EU funding in this respect. And I leave it up to you to decide in which of the two families your papers fit in. A second point I want to make concerns the methodologies we use. And I use we because I myself, with my papers, very much fit in the family of our panelists. So from a methodological viewpoint, I think we are a little bit entrapped in the existing methodological approaches and are thus becoming a little bit boring. So what do we all do? And when I say what do we all do, I checked what you guys in EUNPEC have done. I also checked what 3 other Horizon 2020 projects have done. WOSCAP, IECU, and EU CIFCAP, which has been presented here last year. So we basically speak about 4 big international projects, in total worth about 10 million euro. And now listen how smart we are in devising our methodological approaches. So what do? We go to post-conflict society for a week, maybe 2, depends on the time. You know, we are so busy, or pretend that we're very busy. Equipped with more or less robust methodological framework that we have developed earlier. But when we come to the region or to the post-conflict society, we don't do anything else or much else except 2 things. So first we review some legal frameworks the EU or other international operation is using. Then we also check what kind of peace building or conflict management projects the EU launched in a particular post-conflict society. And then second, and here is kind of our main emphasis, we interview several people. Or sometimes, but this would be more an exception, we do surveying, or sometimes we also organize focus groups. So to be comprehensive in our interviews, or maybe better to say that we try to establish an illusion of comprehensiveness in our research, we first talk to the EU representatives or representatives of other international organizations that are active in the field. Either in the mission, so in a post-conflict zone, or in Brussels, as we have already heard. So this is a must. Then second, because we are trying to be as local as we can, then we talk to representatives of NGOs. And we claim that by talking to representatives of NGOs, we try to provide with an illusion of inclusivity. So not only international organizations, but also local NGOs. And then the last thing that we do, and this is becoming more and more popular, as already Professor Ginty explained, we try to include some local grassroots voices that hold particular views regarding the role of the EU or other international organizations. And here we try to provide an illusion that we do a local turn in peace building. So we aim to build our knowledge maybe in inverted commas, by asking people what they think on a particular topic. And here we sometimes fall in the trap because we stem from the assumption that these people, so our interviewees, would talk the truth. Why do we assume so? It's problematic to assess the value of interviews especially when you speak to local staff. So those local staff working for international organizations. Why is this problematic, in my opinion? Because we are all aware that these people usually have significantly higher salaries than their compatriots who do not work for international organizations. So can we really expect that by talking to locals working for international organizations, we could really get something meaningful? Because people are, of course, afraid that they can lose a relatively well-paid job. So I wonder, in general, why we all believe in power of interviews so much. And another worrying element of research in post-conflict environments lies in the fact that people in such societies are, unsurprisingly, rather hesitant to share sensitive information with the other. And we, as researchers, we usually are the other. Even if some local NGOs from Pristina comes to Mitrovica, which is a small neighborhood, or goes to, I don't know, Gnilane or wherever, they are, even they can be understood as a foreigner, because it's quite difficult to overcome this, let's say, often very difficult to overcome the suspicion that we work for someone that sometimes we have probably all been accused that we work as spies and all other things. So for these reasons, I believe that a solid and robust analysis of the EU conflict resolution and post-conflict settings, that we should maybe rather talk to those people who have been fired by the EU missions or have maybe left the EU mission. And some of them that have been working on ULEX cannot miss some names. For example, we all know Andrea Capusella, who wrote a very interesting book, but only after he left ULEX. So these voices might be more interesting to be heard. But of course, these kind of people are very difficult to be found or to be caught. Well, I mean, differences with those who publish something, such as Andrea Capusella had. And this kind of approach, so headhunting, this headhunting would require a lot of much more time and energy. And of course, for us, it's much easier to send an official email to the EU mission, which then, in assistance with the PR department, find relevant experts for us. Maybe relying on interviews is also a result of our laziness for not doing some other sort of analysis. And this will be my last point. We know that several methodological winter and summer schools offer different courses that teach on great new research techniques rather than surveying and interviewing only. But we usually leave this kind of methodological learning to PhD students. They should learn, right? While we comfortably stick to the usual suspects in methodology, interviews and surveys. So in other words, I think I'm familiar only with one or maybe 1.5 papers, but these were conference papers, where one of the most obvious research methods for our scope of research has been used. So a method called social network analysis. And this corresponds to what the Professor Ginty suggested earlier when he talked about circuits and so on. Even though we know and continuously claim that CSDP and the EU and all these kind of things are about networks, but still, you know, we resist on learning a little bit more about these methods and then use this in our research. So yeah, I will make stop here and we will discuss things further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I saw that there was a lot of writing here during this bold and provocative commenting, so I would only ask you to be very brief in order to leave enough time for the questions of the audience. Thank you. So, in whatever we want. Mr. Blockmans.
Yeah. Okay, well, most of your comments are well taken. It's good to be self-critical. I wouldn't go as far as to be cynical about what we do. Certainly funding resources, you know, and the availability for them to a great extent will define the scope of activities which you can deploy. And I will leave it to my colleagues, you know, to say, to react to some of your points when they deal with empirical research done in the field. For us, based in Brussels, our field is Brussels. So we're working in the constant surf, basically, of policymakers, diplomats who are networked back to their capitals, of course, sister think tanks, you know, with which we cooperate in broader networks as well, in order to sound out first on the basis of a textual analysis, process tracing, and then interviews to complement, you know, basically the desk research. What you know, the nature of the beast is and what it says, and whether there's any feedback loops basically that are taken on board as learning capacities are being built up.
Yeah, thanks, Rock. I mean, that's I would say this is the laziness of the commentator to be commenting like this, because you didn't actually comment on the papers. You commented on a straw man you created for yourself, which is a methodological straw man, methodological problematic straw man. which I have difficulties to react to because I have in my paper there are no interviews. There are 2, and then we had surveys, of course, but those you didn't comment on. So, you know, all these things that you said are, well, they're there and you said them, but of course, that would be my reaction to it.
I'm actually going to take it as a much more constructive technique and hopefully an invitation to the methods cafe, because I think it's actually a lot of very important points. Some of them I completely agree with. Some of them I'm going to defend because we actually thought about them in this particular project. I completely agree with you that a lot of the funding arrangements guide what we do as researchers. That's just the nature of the beast. The second nature of the beast, and so I work at a UK institution, I need to go through ethics procedures for every single thing that I do, right? Which means, unlike during my PhD, where part of my analysis on sort of Bosnia and sort of looking at that was literally getting drunk with people, I can't do that anymore because that doesn't go with the ethics, right? So looking at the networks and things like that in a more informal way. It's much more difficult to get a lot of things approved these days. But at the same time, I would also say that we actually had serious considerations with this UNPAC process around a lot of methodologies, and this was inspired by the fact that we brought together sort of people working in sort of peace and conflict studies around the local turn, and then people working in sort of institutionalist thinking. And a lot of the design, if you look at sort of the sequences of how things were designed, had to do not just going to Brussels or not going to, I don't know, ULEX and asking what they think, but first actually figuring out what the locals were saying, right? And I think that's already something that's a bit of an innovation, because our usual step is, you're right, we do call ULEX headquarters and ask, who do you have to interview, or call and desperately want to interview an EUSR, right? Because obviously EUSR is going to tell you the whole truth about what they're doing in the country. So the idea was to flip it around, first talk to the people, get some surveys done, and then go to sort of people that actually can interpret that for us. And for us, the best proxy in this particular paper was the civil society representatives, because my only other option was, I'm going to interpret surveys myself, right? So that was the thing. And then our next thinking was, and this is where obviously the papers that we present don't tell the whole story, is going to actually speak to the implementers of the mission. So Kari and I, one of the things that we did, particularly in this paper when talking to ULEX staff, we avoided sort of the Pristina headquarters as much as we could, talking to people that were there for years at a time. And ironically, the way we selected it was by talking to one fired and one ex sort of ULEX judge and a prosecutor. And they were, you need to talk to this person because they're actually going to tell you a bit more than just sort of what ULEX wants you to hear, right? So that's my intervention.
Thank you. Irena.
Okay, your comment about laziness. I think laziness, in my opinion, is not to go to field work, but rather to rely on the information which is already written by someone else, or which is conducted by someone else, and then it's very easy, you just go to Google, you search this information, and then you copy-paste and do some changes. But if you make effort, you go to Brussels, you spend a lot of money, and you know Brussels is a very expensive city. And when you are able to meet the people, and if you can get this information, and the information which you have already in your hands, I think this is not laziness, this is more time-consuming and spending a lot of money. For example, in my case, I need to find coordination problems and issues of interinstitutional coordination, which even if I find on the internet, this will be written by someone else. It's not any official document or treaty which says about there was a tension between two USRs. So this information people find by interviews. And the people who don't work in the EU, actually it's very difficult to find these people. But because, for example, it's about a year I'm looking to get response from the USR Peter Semneby, who is now serving as an ambassador of in Afghanistan. And if this person still works in the EU, you will be very lucky and you will be very successful to meet him, because even most of the people who are there, they don't even agree to meet you. And you don't have a guarantee that if this person is not working in the EU, he will agree to meet you and he will tell the whole information. Why should he? I mean, he might have other things to worry or some threats, I don't know. But yes, so, and there are some projects which you cannot conduct without interviews. So in this case, how you would comment? How would you advise to write thesis or paper if you need interviews?
I assume you would also like to comment, but we really need to ask for the questions from the audience. So the floor is yours. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Actually, I would like to take it further because, well, clearly the whole project and the conversation that we have when we analyze EU policy or EU projects in the Balkans and other countries, Eastern Partnership, is often a sort of interdisciplinary exercise by definition. So by definition, you're going to have people who are doing EU studies and whose field is Brussels and who will be working there. And sometimes I'm thinking that like people like Stephen or other colleagues in CEPS, they don't do interview. They do participatory observation all day long, or going for lunch with diplomats or going to forums. On this multitude of interactions, it's going far beyond the interviews. But I would like to take the point that was raised by the discussant, is that when we going to the field, and we also should acknowledge the fact that in other domains, like development studies, people who are trying to investigate, development aid of World Bank in Kenya, they go and, Mateja, you know our colleagues from Cambridge very well, they went and spent 6, 5, 10 months doing internship in the Kenyan Ministry of Agriculture. And of course they would know much, that we feel the field material much better than us who are going there for 3, 4, 5 days and interviewing people. And this is why development studies brings unique insights into what's going on there. Right? Unfortunately, or well, this is the nature of the beast, if I can use this metaphor, is that we don't have either well, finances, but there's also the question that we don't raise this issue when we apply for the projects. Right? When colleagues from other disciplines apply, they say, yes, I need PhD student or postdoc who will spend 7 months working, doing internship in Kosovo, in EU legs, or maybe doing some participant observations somewhere in the field. So I think this is a question of, well, somehow path dependency. It has been working up until now, but that's not the reason for us to believe that we can't go beyond that. Secondly, is it only a sort of social network analysis? If we turn to sort of general anthropological methods, well, that's the problem of anthropology as well. Anthropologists don't like to do policy-oriented projects unless they are in very small niche. They are too abstract and too snobbish to do that. But that's also the existing problem in the field. So I think this conversation is not simply of the problem of specific project, which I think has, well, as any project can be better anyways, but it has delivered very interesting insights, but it's part of bigger conversation about, well, there was crossword about ontology, but what we are as a researcher, what we are supposed to deliver, and who our clients are, and what is the knowledge then.
Thank you.
I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you. And could you just introduce yourself before asking a question and be a bit quicker with the questions, because we really are in a lack of time. And one of the things I read while I was preparing for my first moderating role here was that don't make the panel longer if the lunch follows. So yes, the next question. Don't see it. Do we have any questions? Can we get a... Yes. I don't see any hands raised, I'm sorry. Could you just raise your hand higher?
I have two short questions. Many interesting statements have been made, but I will limit it myself to the two questions. One is regarding to the gentleman who has spoken about the post-conflict solution, rehabilitation, but Is it possible to speak about the post-conflict solution, rehabilitation calls? How do you like it without the political solution? I have in mind that you have spoken about activities of the European Union in the region of the Caucasus. It means Nagorno-Karabakh as one of the unsolving or freezing conflicts. And is it possible to speak about the success story without the political solution? Another issue is regarding to our region, Western Balkan, and the regional cooperation and the presence of numbers of regional initiative organization, fora and NEA as one of the successful story of the instrument of the post-conflict rehabilitation. Do you have some similar project for the another regions? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Perhaps another one, and then we can close the first round. Please, Stanic.
A question on policy. We heard that EU is bad in balancing the goals, the global actor goal with the rule of law or conflict prevention and so on. And I'm curious to know if EU, if it wants to become a global actor, it should leave completely its transformative power ambition and should just depend on different tools. And the other question, as Mateja said, EULEX was the only executive mission. We heard in Brussels at another conference that they're not thinking of repeating it ever again. Is that a good conclusion out of EULEX, or under different conditions, executive type of missions might work?
Thank you. Thank you. So, I assume Professor Bátora has the question, so could you?
Okay. Sure. So to Vsevolod Samochvalov, I mean, this is of course a good question, and obviously ethnographic research, I think that's what you're referring to from social anthropology, would of course be an approach to do these kinds of studies. I mean, you'd have to spend some time in the local environment, but then of course you have other methodological issues related to that, which is situatedness, and you get very situated. Very often, so you might have difficulties to generalize out of the findings that you have if you're there for half a year, 3 years, 4 years, and I think one of the things about us as social scientists is one of the things, at least what I think about as good social science, is this Weberian attempt at verstehen, to understand the world, get an analytical grip on the world. And you can do that with various methodologies, and of course ethnographic would be one, but you might actually be misunderstanding things. That's what I'm trying to say, with being too deeply situated in a particular context. So I think there's a balance to be found here. And ethnographic research is good, but this may not be the only solution to the problem. Yeah, I guess the question about political solution, should there be a political solution to post-conflict? Of course, it has to be political, obviously. So I don't know what else to say. Yeah, and I guess the other questions were maybe directed towards the others. So.
Yeah, to Sonja's question, should the EU shed its ambition about being a transformative power around the world, in the wider world? Of course, in the enlargement context, we're preparing essentially candidate countries to become a member state. There's no model member state. We know that. And we're trying to, but the EU is learning from its own experiences as they develop at the moment. I mean, rule of law is clearly an issue that cuts, both internally as well as externally. But further afield, I think it has already shed it, that wagging finger, the preacher mentality, basically, in some of its policy documents. The EU global strategy and the joint communication on resilience, which followed it, clearly shift the conceptual debate from stabilization, transformation to resilience. A state and a society ought to be able to absorb a shock, basically, and as Teflon, come back into place. That is, in a way, losing a lot of ambition on the side of the EU in trying to address or to transform societies, to its own mirror image. So I'd say that it's already underway, and it should not probably in the immediate neighborhood.
So I'm going to pick up on both Sonia's questions. I think they raise sort of, Americans call them $1 million questions. I'm going to call them €1 billion questions. So the question of transformative power, and I would even extend it further to the Balkans, whether the EU is actually abandoning transformative ideas about the Balkans with the stall enlargement process. Because the biggest gun that they have, that the EU has in its weaponry, is essentially the enlargement agenda. And so this is a question of what happens when, with the missions such as ULEX that we were looking at, it seems that sort of the ideas of democracy and rule of law are getting undermined by other priorities because of security consideration. And we're not the first one to say this. Like, everybody in this room has heard the term stabilitocracy or whatever, stabilitocracy, or it has several different things. So it is a question, I think it's a question worth bringing up to policy people, possibly, in terms of, in terms of the executive missions, is sort of ULEX unique, and will it stay unique in sort of the EU arsenal of CSDP missions? To an extent, I think you're correct in saying we probably won't see anything like ULEX. But on the other hand, and this is where I'm going to probably say the name of the institution wrong, the Kosovo War Chambers, right, or whatever it is, this new institution that they're now establishing, is again going to be run as a CSDP mission. So issues still need to be discussed about that. And on top of that, EU is funding a lot of other arrangements, in particular with sort of the problems with and this is my pet project now, the criminal accountability in sort of post-conflict contexts in Africa, where the ICC, International Criminal Court, is not active. The EU might actually be funding a lot of the processes in South Sudan, which we might see sort of hybrid courts, which will have these executive powers. So I think these questions that we're raising about the ability of us as international community to directly implement things in sort of post-conflict countries will remain relevant in the future. But no, we're not going to have the same problems as ULEX. So.
Thank you. Ms. Mnatsakanyan, do you have any further, or I would also like to give a floor to Professor Zupančič just for a short comment.
Thanks for your question. Regarding the conflict Nagorno-Karabakh, which is a frozen conflict as well, I need to say that in general the frozen conflicts, the conflicts in the southern Caucasus, Cyprus conflict, Transnistria, the difference between frozen conflicts and non-frozen conflicts is that the frozen conflicts, they first of all don't have their peace agreement. So these conflicts, they can escalate at any moment. And therefore, in my opinion, without a political solution, political engagement, the confidence building incentives or post-conflict reconstruction, this cannot finally resolve the conflicts. Of course, the EU, through Instrument for Stability, it funds some projects of confidence building in Nagorno-Karabakh, but I don't think that these kind of projects can finally resolve a conflict. So if they could resolve these conflicts, would have been already resolved, but they still exist, the frozen conflicts. And well, example, it was in 2008, the escalation of Russia-Georgia war, and 1st of April 2016, the 4-day war, Nagorno-Karabakh. So I think the political solution, the political engagement is the only solution to the frozen conflicts.
Thank you. Professor Zupančič.
Maybe one sentence only. I myself am very much part of the same research, the same way of thinking when doing research. So I'm not claiming that, I can do anything better than anyone else in this room. So my call was mostly, was pertaining more to the use of some other methods, as have already been suggested by one of the persons that posed the question. So participants, observation. Then I suggested social network analysis, etc. So from, of course, we cannot escape the trap of doing research which can acquire funding. You know, this is something that would be very difficult to overcome. And also we cannot overcome that we would not use interviews and surveys. Of course, these are logical tools. But so my call is only that we try to think of some other methods that could provide some other answers to our questions.
Thank you. Perhaps one more question, and if not, yes, please. The first.
Jelena Pejic, I am PhD student at the Faculty of Political Sciences and also researcher at Belgrade Center for Security Policy. Well, the issue of transformative power and normative power has come up, and Mateja Peter has also reflected on some of my dilemmas while conceptualizing my future thesis. So the question is, since also Mr. Blockmans has said that, and we have noticed it, that even the EU has been shifting from its normative discourse, and even in the region, where we can see that security interests have been prioritized. So that is border security and regional, shaping a regional milieu. That is totally realist discourse. So is this normative power concept obsolete or irrelevant for further research of the EU's enlargement policy in the Western Balkans? So it would be very useful for me to know, since I was planning to use this concept. Thank you very much.
Yes,
I don't think it's entirely obsolete, but I think it has to be problematized, right? Because partly, the reason why I do think that it's worth researching and it's worth thinking about it is because missions in this region, or sort of representative in this region, when anybody comes from Brussels, that's the talk that they employ, right? And so partly it is my job, your job as a researcher to sort of problematize what is happening in it. And I think you will be part of a very rich research agenda by doing that.
So yeah, you're absolutely right that there's a shift from what used to be a focus on the EU as a normative power towards more of a realist approach to the EU's external policy. Even people like Joschka Fischer, someone who is a leftist federalist, cosmopolitan European, would argue that the European Union will not survive unless it embraces a geopolitical kind of an approach to its neighborhood. But then, of course, the question is, how do we think about normative power? Because, I mean, of course, there are conceptual ideas about normative power that have been developed in the 1990s, early 2000s. Now, if you think about the kind of thing that was adopted at the Council yesterday, or the day before, yeah, actually yesterday, the nature of sanctions for regimes or for companies and individuals involved in producing dangerous chemical substances, which is global. There's not a geographical approach to particular countries. This is about being involved in a particular agenda, in a particular policy field. And it doesn't matter where you come from, you will be affected by sanctions if you're a company or an individual involved in producing those chemical substances. So this is a shift in thinking about normative power in Europe. I think this is something which should definitely be an object of research, this shift, because that's an interesting way of thinking about, there are a lot of people who are, want to study in Europe, work in Europe, be working with European capital in their companies and so on, with having those investments. So I think there is, this is an area which is really exciting. So I think transformative power in Europe is in transformation, and I think we should be studying that. Yeah.
Thank you. Does anyone want to add something in this? Or do we have any questions? So then I would actually also like to conclude to thank you all for your participation, for your comments and questions. And I could perhaps conclude on this very note on the EU's transformative and normative power in global arena, actually, and to remind us all that these operations and interventions we are looking here are actually not only the test cases for EU's conflict management tool, but its actorness and its role in the international affairs in general. And looking into the perceptions of non-EU non-EU countries is perhaps probably the best way to see why the EU still struggles to have a long-lasting impact in global affairs. And since, although not the only one, this region has definitely been one of the major laboratories for the EU conflict management and resolution toolkit. So I assume it's a good place, and the Belgrade Security Forum is a good place to send a strong call that the local should be taken seriously, both in the practice and the theory and literature on the peace building. So thank you all for participating and coming, and see you at the lunch. Thank you. Thank you very much. This was the first one.